Hello friends, my name is JJ. So last week I made a video all about the state of Canadian politics as it appears to stand in the autumn of 2023. But because of my particular production cycle, I was unable to include any reference to one particular story that has really thrust Canada into the headlines around the world recently. Many random Indian viewers were very keen to point this out to me. Here is a selection of some of their comments.
Canada should stop being safe haven for terrorists. Why Canada is supporting Khalistani extremists? Canada destroys the relationships between India and Canada. Justin Trudeau making safe haven for terrorists. It's time for Canada to wake up for their country. How can Canada grant citizenship to person who is declared terrorist in other democratic nations? Canada has a Khalistani and Trudeau problem. Solve it ASAP.
And in today's video, I hope to explain what this all means. So Canada has quite a high population of people of Indian descent. My province of British Columbia, which is the closest to Asia, has been receiving large numbers of Indian immigrants for many decades, with the province's second largest city of Surrey being well known for its large Indian population and Indian cultural influences. For reasons that are not entirely clear, a disproportionate number of early Indian immigrants to BC came from the relatively small Punjab province of India, which has in turn invited a steadily increasing inflow of Punjabis ever since. Punjabi immigrants naturally want to move to a place where they know there will be a lot of folks who share their language, culture, and religion. Most Punjabis are of the Sikh faith, and as a result, so too are a lot of Indo-Canadians. Sikhism is a rather distinct religion of many highly visible traditions. Sikh men are easily recognizable with their turbans and long beards, and almost always have Singh as either their middle or last name, and Sikhs pray in these very large and striking temples with traditional Indian-style architecture, which are known as gurdwaras. Now, before I go any further, I want to explain a controversial decision that I have made about this video. At no point am I going to discuss the history of Sikhs in India or their status in India today, nor am I going to seek to analyze or debate Sikh political ideas or movements, even though that topic may seem highly relevant to the rest of this story. But I am doing this for a very specific reason, which is that I am trying to tell a Canadian story here. Canada has played little to no role in shaping Indian politics, and to the extent that Indian politics are relevant in Canada, it's because people have brought those politics here. By leaving the viewer largely oblivious about the details of Sikh politics, I want to convey the idea of Canada as a country that has inherited a political tradition that the vast majority of Canadians do not understand or care about, and how this deep asymmetry of passion between Sikh and non-Sikh Canadians has affected the events I'm about to describe. What I will say is only this. There is an idea in Punjab Sikh culture that India is oppressive to the Sikhs, and Punjab should therefore become an independent country for the Sikhs called Khalistan. People who buy into this idea are called Khalistanis, and it tends to be associated with folks on the more fundamentalist end of the Sikh religious spectrum. For whatever reason, Khalistanism has proven popular with many Sikhs in Canada, and like many political ideologies, there is unfortunately also a violent manifestation of Khalistanism as well, and this too is present in Canada. In June of 1985, a small cell of Khalistani extremists here in British Columbia successfully got a bomb placed on an Air India flight destined for Mumbai. En route to a stopover in London, the plane blew up over the Celtic Sea, killing all 329 people on board, most of them young Indo-Canadian families on their way to visit relatives. It was the worst North American terrorist attack prior to 9/11. Despite the spectacular nature of the attack, the dominant Canadian reaction was confusion and apathy, however. Because the killers and most of their victims were of Indian background, many of Canada's non-Indian majority interpreted the attack as a tragic but exotic event of little relevance to mainstream Canada. To this day, the attack has never really entered the Canadian imagination as one of the great tragedies of our history. And I'm sure there are many young Canadians watching this right now who are hearing about it for the first time. This was partially an indictment of Canadian racism, the idea that Indo-Canadians somehow didn't really count in the way that other Canadians do. But it was also a revelation that a unique flavor of political violence had come to Canada that the majority of Canadians were relatively indifferent to. The ensuing arrest and failed prosecution of the Air India bombers is seen as a similarly damning indictment of Canadian society. During the trial of the attack's 2 surviving ringleaders, which took 18 years to organize and ended with the acquittal of both, it was revealed that the Canadian police and intelligence services had not taken the threat of Sikh extremism particularly seriously in the lead-up to the attack, and had accordingly failed to provide the government with enough evidence to prove the guilt of either man. At one point, it was revealed that Canadian intelligence here in BC, the center of Canada's Sikh community, didn't even have any agents who spoke the Punjabi language. The perceived incompetence of Canadian authorities in bringing justice to these men who had caused so much trauma for hundreds of Indian families contributed to a worsening of relations between Canada and India. Indian diplomats had expressed concern about Sikh extremists operating in Canada prior to the attack, and there was a sense that if Canadian officials had taken these worries more seriously, perhaps more could have been done. On the other end of the spectrum, Canada's failure to convict anyone in relation to the Air India bombing provided cover to fundamentalist Sikhs eager to hold 2 somewhat contradictory ideas about the men accused of masterminding the attack. They were somehow simultaneously believed to be great heroes of the Khalistani cause, but at the same time, completely innocent men who hadn't actually done anything. In fact, the Indian government had probably blown up that plane themselves to frame them. By all accounts, supporters of this conspiracy theory and other forms of apologism and support for Khalistani terrorism continued to enjoy a stable base in Canada over the decades. A notorious embodiment of this is the tendency of some Sikh temples in Canada to proudly display big posters of Hardeep Singh Parmar, who was the Canadian founder of the terrorist group that planned the Air India bombing. Parmar, an immigrant who had fled back to India after the attacks and was later killed by police there, remains perhaps the most recognizable symbol of Sikh extremism in Canada, easily identifiable by his big yellow turban with the little blue cloth on top. Now, what makes this situation uniquely politically complicated is that during this same period, Sikhs were starting to emerge as a powerful voting bloc in Canada. In the 1980s, the Canadian census estimated that there were less than 70,000 Sikhs in Canada, mostly in British Columbia. Today, that number has increased tenfold to over 700,000, or about 2% of the Canadian population, which is actually about the same as their share of the population in India. Though BC continues to have Canada's largest Sikh population, there are now substantial Sikh communities all across the country, and you can see Sikh temples everywhere from Edmonton to Montreal. I should just take a moment here to state clearly that although we are mostly talking about Sikh extremism and terrorism today, the vast majority of Canadian Sikhs are, of course, perfectly lovely, kind, peaceful people. The rise of a large Sikh Canadian middle class is, in fact, one of the great triumphs of Canadian multiculturalism and assimilation. The steady progression of a people once associated with low-status jobs like taxi drivers and gas station attendants into a prosperous community increasingly filled with doctors and lawyers and businessmen. And politicians. Sikh Canadians, like Indo-Canadians more broadly, have proven very politically savvy and are probably among Canada's most disproportionately successful minority group at the political level. The first Sikh member of the Canadian Parliament was elected in 1993, and since then there have been dozens of practicing Sikhs elected at both the federal and provincial level, along with multiple Sikh cabinet ministers. The current Canadian Parliament features 15 self-identified Sikhs, including Defence Minister Hardeep Singh and Tim Uppal, the deputy leader of the Conservative Party. Prime Minister Trudeau actually bragged a while ago that he had more Sikhs in his cabinet than Prime Minister Modi did in India.
I have more Sikhs in my cabinet than Modi does.
Now, why Sikhs are so successful in Canadian politics isn't simply a matter of there being a lot of Sikhs in Canada, although that's obviously part of it. As I wrote in this 2019 article for the Washington Post, a lot of it has to do with how political candidates are chosen in Canada. So in Canada, a political party's candidates for the federal or provincial parliament are not appointed by the party hierarchy like they are in Europe, nor are they elected by the general public like they are in the US. Rather, they are chosen by small in-person gatherings of a few hundred party supporters. This is a very old-fashioned system in which a candidate literally just has to wrangle up enough friends from the community to win a popularity contest in a high school auditorium or whatever. And it's a system that selects for a certain type of politician more than others. Religious people in general tend to do very well in this system, since church is a great place to wrangle up supporters. And Sikhs tend to do particularly well, since their temples tend to be organized quite hierarchically, meaning a politician allied with the temple leadership can often count on getting a lot of bodies to show up at his nomination meeting. The problem is that some of the most politically active members of many Sikh gurdwaras in Canada also tend to be really into the Khalistani stuff. Not like the active terrorist side, but certainly some of the terrorist apologist or conspiracy theory side. The posters of Talwinder Singh Parmar set. And as a result, a lot of Canadian politicians of all religions and in all of the major parties behave as if Khalistanis are a significant enough force in Canadian politics to not be worth offending, and maybe even worth courting. So here are some examples. In 2018, Prime Minister Trudeau went on a rather tense trip to India, the Modi administration having quite a lot of skepticism of Canada's seriousness in dealing with radical Khalistanis who India continued to claim were still using Canada as a base for organizing terrorist attacks.
Therefore, the sovereignty of our states, the unity of our states, all those who challenge these, we cannot tolerate them.
Trudeau's delegation included Member of Parliament Randeep Sarai, a Sikh politician considered on the somewhat soft on Khalistanis side of things, who in turn brought along a guy called Jaspal Atwal, an Indo-Canadian activist in the British Columbia wing of Trudeau's Liberal Party. Jaspal Atwal, as it turned out, was also a one-time member of a Khalistani terrorist group. In 1986, a minister from the Punjab government had come to BC to attend a relative's wedding and was shot twice by a gang of men that included Mr. Atwal. He would later serve 5 years for attempted murder. Now, everyone in Trudeau's delegation claimed to have no idea who actually invited Mr. Atwal to come to India with them, but the incident was a huge diplomatic disaster, as you might expect. Hoping to capitalize on this, back in Canada, the Conservative Party introduced a resolution to the Parliament that declared that the House value the contributions of Canadian Sikhs and Canadians of Indian origin in our national life, condemn in the strongest terms all forms of terrorism, including Khalistani extremism and the glorification of any individuals who have committed acts of violence to advance the cause of an independent Khalistani state in India, and stand with a united India. This resolution, however, proved controversial with many Sikh activists who lobbied hard to get the Conservatives to pull the motion, which they did. Later that year, the Canadian Department of Public Safety released a report surveying various domestic security threats in Canada. One part noted that some individuals in Canada continue to support Sikh Khalistani extremist ideologies and movements. This line also offended many Sikh activists, including Member of Parliament Sarai, who who demanded the government scrub the report of this explicit reference to Sikh extremism. In an open letter to the public safety minister, he said, "In the entirety of the report, there is no cause to show that there is any such risk, rise, or threat of Sikh Khalistani extremism in Canada or abroad. Therefore, to add such a group as a concern without showing a cause or factual evidence incorrectly identifies them as a threat." And the public safety minister listened, and the relevant chapter of the report was watered down. Out went the reference to Sikh Khalistani extremism, and in went the rather awkwardly euphemistic term, extremists who support violent means to establish an independent state within India. Another Sikh member of parliament who had complained about the intelligence report, accusing it of stoking fear without any evidence about the Sikh community, was Jagmeet Singh, the head of the New Democratic Party. As leader of the NDP, Canada's third largest political party, Jagmeet has run for Prime Minister twice, soon to be 3 times, and in that sense you could easily argue is the highest profile Sikh politician in Canadian history. Once again, I think that his ability to rise to a position like this reflects well on Canada as an inclusive, meritocratic society. You know, the idea that the son of Indian immigrants and a member of a small and not well understood religious community could someday find himself standing alongside a bunch of white guys on Canada's most important debate stage. But that said, it is also true that Jagmeet has undeniably been on the more soft on Khalistani side of the Canadian Sikh political spectrum, and that this has caused him a lot of controversy over the years. Back when he was still a member of the Ontario Provincial Legislature, Singh attended multiple rather militant pro-Khalistani independence rallies where he accused the Indian government of committing a genocide against Sikhs. In 2016, he unsuccessfully tried to get the Ontario legislature to pass a motion accusing the Indian government of having committed genocide, and he has since tried to get Canada's national parliament to do the same. Most controversially of all, however, in 2017, shortly after he was elected head of the NDP, he gave an interview in which he seemed to be sympathetic to the conspiratorial view of the Air India bombing, implying that we still didn't really know who was behind the attack.
What about putting up posters of Parmar, the architect of the Air India bombing, as a martyr? Is that appropriate, yes or no?
So it is so unacceptable that the violence that was committed, the heinous massacre that was committed, is something that Sikhs, Muslims, Hindus all denounce. The violence that was perpetrated against innocent Canadian lives is something we all denounce. I regularly denounce it on the anniversary. It's something that we all collectively are opposed to. There is no question about this, that innocent lives were killed, and it is completely unacceptable. It needs to be denounced as a terrorist act.
So you won't denounce those posters of Parmar?
I don't know who was responsible, but I think we need to find out who's truly responsible. We need to make sure that the investigation actually results in a conviction of someone who's actually responsible.
He did later walk this statement back in a subsequent interview.
Should you not condemn the glorification of Talvinder Parmar when he's the mastermind of the Air India bombing?
Very fair question. I think first off, we can't lose sight of who we're talking about here. Air India was the worst terrorist attack in the history of our country. Hundreds of Canadians were killed, and the families and the loved ones that have seen that loss are still reeling from that pain. And so we need to understand that. There was an inquiry that was conducted into this horrible terrorist act. The inquiry ended up in the re-traumatization of those loved ones and family members, having to relive the pain of that. There was also at the same time a feeling that Sikhs were being all collectively punished for the acts of some individuals. That was also very painful. The inquiry identified specifically Talvinder Singh Parmar, and I accept the findings of the investigation of the inquiry. I accept them and I condemn all those responsible.
So you accept that Talvinder Parmar was the mastermind of Air India?
Yes, I accept the findings of the inquiry, and that's one of the findings.
There is evidence that the Indian government actively dislikes Jagmeet Singh because of his political views. He has not been able to visit India in over a decade because he keeps getting his visa application denied on the grounds that anyone indulging in, directly or indirectly, attacking India's sovereignty and territorial integrity is not welcome in India, as India's Consul General in Toronto put it. Singh, for his part, has suggested that his supporters have been targeted by intimidation campaigns directed by agents of the Indian government.
Breaking news from Surrey, where a man has been shot dead inside a vehicle.
On June 18th of this year, at around 8:30 p.m., the president of one of the largest Sikh temples in Canada was shot to death by masked gunmen in the temple parking lot. This temple, the Guru Nanak Gurdwara, located in Surrey, British Columbia, was known for being one of Canada's more radical ones, with the slain temple president, Hardeep Singh Nijjar, being an outspoken Khalistani. President Nijjar was a wanted man in India, accused of being involved in multiple violent incidents and criminal conspiracies. At the time of his death, a bulletin from India's counter-terrorism agency declared he was
conspiring and planning to carry out a major terrorist attack in India. Hardeep Singh Nijjar has been engaged in several activities that are prejudicial to the sovereignty and integrity of India, such as sourcing finance to procure arms or ammunitions, and training Sikh youth to carrying out terrorist activities in India. He intends to execute the attack at a time and place where there is a large gathering, so that there are maximum casualties.
Nijjar was an Indian immigrant, but a naturalized citizen of Canada since 2007. The government of India had repeatedly sought his extradition, but the government of Canada had refused. Nevertheless, by Nijjar's own admission, he had been warned by Canadian security officials that he should be aware that there were credible threats to his life. The temple community immediately blamed India for his death, but for several months the story didn't make much news in Canada. But that all changed on September 18th.
Statements by ministers. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, today I'm rising to inform the House of an extremely serious matter. I just informed the leaders of the opposition directly, but I want now to speak with all Canadians. Over the past number of weeks, Canadian security agencies have been actively pursuing credible allegations of a potential link between agents of the government of India and the killing of a Canadian citizen, Hardeep Singh Nijjar. Canada is a rule of law country. The protection of our citizens and defense of our sovereignty are fundamental. Our top priorities have therefore been, one, that our law enforcement and security agencies ensure the continued safety of all Canadians, and two, that all steps be taken to hold perpetrators of this murder to account. Canada has declared its deep concerns to the top intelligence and security officials of the Indian government. Last week at the G20, I brought them personally and directly to Prime Minister Modi in no uncertain terms. Any involvement of a foreign government in the killing of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil is an unacceptable violation of our sovereignty.
Now, this statement by Prime Minister Trudeau directly implicating India in Mr. Nijjar's death was so dramatic, there was initially some skepticism that it could even be true, but a few days later, the American ambassador to Canada, David Cohen, confirmed that the Prime Minister's words were in fact supported by Canada's closest allies, the so-called Five Eyes.
Are you able to answer whether or not that intelligence came from the U.S.?
So I'm not. I wouldn't in any circumstance. I think I've already gone further than you should have expected that I'd be willing to go by confirming that there was shared intelligence among Five Eyes partners that that helped lead Canada to making the statements that the Prime Minister made.
In any case, this bombshell news sent shockwaves across Canada and around the world, and was interpreted in different ways by different people. To many Sikh Canadians, especially those on the Khalistani side, it validated their worst suspicions that their cause was being actively and violently opposed by the Indian state. Anti-India Sikh protests accordingly broke out in multiple cities across Canada. Jagmeet Singh, for his part, vowed to leave no stone unturned in the pursuit of justice, including holding Narendra Modi accountable. Mr. Modi's government, meanwhile, reacted with extreme fury, aggressively denying Prime Minister Trudeau's allegation, and also ratcheting up rhetoric that Canada was a bad ally and even a threat to India. As the Indian Foreign Ministry put it,
such unsubstantiated allegations seek to shift the focus from the Khalistani terrorists and extremists who have been provided shelter in Canada and continue to threaten India's sovereignty and territorial integrity. The inaction of the Canadian government on this matter has been a long-standing and continuing concern.
A day later, the department issued another statement alluding to the anti-India protests occurring in various Sikh-heavy parts of Canada, saying,
"In view of growing anti-India activities and politically condoned hate crimes and criminal violence in Canada, all Indian nationals there and those contemplating travel are urged to exercise utmost caution. Given the deteriorating security environment in Canada, Indian students in particular are advised to exercise extreme caution and remain vigilant."
That last part was clearly an effort to target one of the strongest ties between India and Canada, namely the high number of Indian nationals who study at Canadian colleges and universities. A day after that, the Foreign Ministry went even further still, with their press guy having this to say.
Yeah, look, if there is any country, if you're talking about reputational issues and reputational damage, if there's any country that needs to look at this, I think it is Canada and its growing reputation as a place, as a safe haven for terrorists, for extremists, and for organized crime. I think that's the country that needs to worry about its international reputation.
Now, for many non-Sikh Canadians and Canadian allies, this whole episode has presented a difficult dilemma. On the one hand, it is a profound infringement of Canada's sovereignty for a foreign government to stage a surprise, targeted killing of one of its citizens on its soil. Canada and India are not in any state of war with each other, and Canada is obviously not some sort of failed state without a rule of law. So there's no obvious justification for breaking so many diplomatic protocols between two nations that are supposed to have closer than normal ties as members of the English Commonwealth and all of that. On the other hand, however, I do not think that there is necessarily a lot of love lost in Canada for the late Mr. Nijjar. Canada, and the West in general, doesn't have any interest in Khalistanism, even in its most benign form. It weakens Indian unity, and India is a major geostrategic ally of the West, currently being aggressively courted as a counterbalance to China. If Nijjar was indeed the horrible terrorist that the Indians claim, then it will be easy for Canada to shrug off his murder as something that's more of a technical crime than a meaningful one, significant more in diplomatic theory than any practical consequence. And I think that is the assessment of Canada's national interest that will ultimately prevail in the Prime Minister's office. But the question is, to what extent will the pursuit of that interest be moderated or slowed by the Liberal Party's desire to remain on the good side of the faction of their political base that has now become more radicalized against India than ever. The calculation does become a bit easier if we assume that Trudeau's partisan opponents in the Conservative Party have no interest in trying to squeeze him on this issue, and instead share the same broad understanding of Canada's national interest. When Donald Trump was first elected, Henry Kissinger said that it might establish coherence between our foreign policy and our domestic situation. I think about that quote a lot because I think it is very insightful into how foreign policy works in modern democracies. I get the impression that a lot of Indians, particularly those whose politics lean in a more nationalistic direction, are sort of broadly aware of the Air India bombing and know that there have been Sikh terrorists based out of Canada in the past, and are aware that there are Sikh politicians in Canada who have sort of defensive opinions about Khalistanism and Khalistani terrorists, including that one Sikh guy who Justin Trudeau has some sort of parliamentary alliance with. And these sorts of Indians use these bits and pieces of knowledge to conclude that the government of Canada is like actively pro-Khalistani. I likewise get the impression that Prime Minister Modi's swaggering, often rather chauvinistic government has a bit of a India against the world mentality that is inclined to regard other countries with maximum suspicion, and it is through this mindset that he analyzes Canada-India relations. And I know for a fact that here in Canada, some of our political institutions have been designed in such a way that a small group can exercise outsized power, with Sikh radicals being one such group. And I know that a lot of Canadian politicians don't really know or care much about the cultures or politics of foreign countries, and just defer and pander to whatever loud and passionate activists seem to care about, if that means votes can be had. I don't know how the next few months or years of Canada-India relations will play out, but I do know that it probably wouldn't hurt if both countries sought to establish a little bit less coherence between their foreign policies and domestic situations.